Hello there my fellow art kids and welcome to this little video. Today we're just going to be having a little conversation about shading. So we're going to look at a basic approach to shading and then a couple of methods and ideas that you might want to play around with in order to find your own specific style of shading. I use Clip Studio Paint for all of my digital art, but a lot of what I'll talk about today will be able to easily transfer over to Photoshop or to Procreate or pretty much any other digital art program you use. So let's get stuck into it. Now before we start pinpointing exactly where our light and our shadows need to go, a quick little tip that I've found from my own personal experience is that I tend to get quite caught up sometimes in what my flats look like, and it really affects where I think I should put shadows, when in reality my flats have got nothing to do with that. So a little hint is to just lay down a flat layer of grey or whatever flat colour you like, and that'll help you just focus on the shadows instead of getting all caught up in the pretty colours of your flats. So first things first is you need to identify your light source. So with this drawing, say we've got our little sun up here and he's got lots of rays, and this is where our light from the drawing will be coming from. So if we think about the light coming in from this way, we can imagine that it's going to hit parts of him like his fingertips, probably his hair, get some of his little cheek as well, and just on his arms and things like that. We're pretty much just identifying wherever we think will come in direct contact with that sunlight. So that also will include parts of the body that protrude a little bit, like the chin or the nose. Once we have our highlights worked out, we can then use that to deduce where our shadows should be. So what areas of the drawing would be obscured from the light source? So we've got his chin, this little curl under his hair, under his nose, inside of his ears, the inside of his jacket. All of these areas, the light source that we've established wouldn't really be able to get there. So we can look at that and say that that's a really good place where we should be looking at putting the shading in our drawing. Now before we get started on filling in our areas of highlight and shading, it's a really good idea to clip your shading layer so it'll keep all of your artwork nice and clean. So a really good technique is to command click on the icon of your flats layer. So not the little part where it says 100% normal flats, the title, but the actual icon itself where you get the little preview of the layer. And that will select all of the pixels from that layer. And then you can just press the little clipping icon and it'll set that clipping mask to this layer you want to use, which means that when you go to draw, everything you draw will stay within that clipping mask. So now that we've blocked out the area for our lighting, we can look at changing that color to something that's going to work a bit better for shading, and also changing the layer type to an adjustment layer that's going to suit us as well. Now this might sound a little bit counterintuitive because typically we associate shadows with darker colors, but I've found recently that my favorite way to shade is actually with this super light, slightly warm gray set to linear burn. I just think it's really nice and subtle, and it also really warmly complements the drawing, and that's what I've been using for everything recently. I also like it because I can just set my highlight layer to the same color but set it to overlay with the opacity slightly turned down, and it saves me a lot of time kind of having to mess around and find different colors to use for my shading in just like really simple drawings that I just want to bang out as fast as I can. Now just a sidetrack for a little moment, a really cool bonus thing you can use on Clip Studio if you're really stuck on your shading is you can drag in one of the 3D models, and there's actually a tool to be able to drag the light source around. So if we grab this guy and we just kind of like pose him out a little bit and bring him in nice and close, you'll see that you can pretty much replicate also the pose that you want in your drawing, which will help a lot with the lighting. And then once you've got the model where you want it, all you have to do is scroll down on your settings and go to the apply light source option, and there'll be this cool little ball that you can just click and drag and it'll change where the light source on the drawing is. Now, if you ever cannot see this setting when you're playing around with a model, and also this goes for any of the tools on Clip Studio, you can always go down to the bottom right hand corner of the window of that tool and you'll see a little wrench. And if you click on that wrench, it'll open all the settings. So this just kind of helps to keep your workspace clean and not have all the settings that you're never going to touch open. But if it is something you want to see all the time, you can just click on this little box on the left hand side of the column and tick on that eye and then it'll show up. Now we've got the basics of our lighting done, but if we want to push it a little bit further and really flesh out the drawing a little bit more, we can start to look at things like the ambient light. So the ambient light is light that comes from other sources. But it can be things like, for instance, if we have a wall near the character and the light will come down from the light source and it'll bounce off that wall back in the direction of the character. It can also be little secondary light sources, so maybe your main light source is an overhead light, but there's a lamp to the left. Or they're walking at night and there's a street lamp, but they're also looking at their phone, and those are the different light sources. And this just really is a nice way to add a little bit more to your drawing. So for instance here, this light source would be hitting this backside of him, so the places where our highlights aren't reaching. So this is similar to rim light, so just that little bit of light just along the edge. Now these next two lighting features are things that I don't think are 100% necessary for everyone's art style. I personally really enjoy using these things, but again, I don't like prescriptive art advice that says there are 100% do's and 100% don'ts, because I think that gets people really stuck in their head about where to go. So have a play around with these ones, but if you don't like them, that's okay. So the first one we're going to look at is ambient occlusion, and that's basically areas on the drawing where light wouldn't be able to get to. So on this drawing, that would be areas like the inside of the ears, the underside of the chin, the inside of the jacket, and those places, basically, yeah, they cannot be accessed by our main light source or by our secondary ambient light or any of that. Now, personally, in my own art, I've been really enjoying experimenting with including these really dark patches into my line art, so making it a solid element of the line art. I didn't do that today for the purposes of the tutorial, but the way I fill it in now is quite similar to the effect. And I think for people who use weighted line art, this might be a really nice thing to try. It's also very reminiscent of the traditional completely black comic book shading. Now, if you want to do this, you don't need to do it in solid black like I'm doing it now. Usually when I do it in my line art, because I use colored line art, it comes out a little bit lighter. But you could also do it just with another multiply or linear burn layer, whatever you've used for your shading. The other thing is, if you're doing a big drawing, I think sometimes this secondary layer of shading can be really helpful to finish up your drawing, because sometimes you'll be shading big tracks, like a big piece of a cloak or some big long leg or something, and it will start to look a bit flat. So adding in this little bit of extra shading, a little bit of extra definition will help just to kind of keep the drawing alive in those places where there's a lot of the same. Now the final main shading feature I'm going to talk about is subsurface scattering. So what that's referring to is how light interacts with materials that are a little bit translucent. And we might forget, but one of the main things surrounding us that's like that is skin. So if you look at particularly fingers or ears when they're in the light, there is sort of a reddish light that will shine through them. Now this can be really good to add this to your shading, particularly on skin tones. It's just one of those little finessed things that just can make your drawing look really nice. I was painting over it for ages to figure out how I personally wanted to do it and have it look good. But I've found that the easiest way to do it is I just go to my shading layer and I just like to grab the airbrush, the soft brush, and I grab a really light pink or red, depending on just kind of like the tones of the overall drawing. And I just go around the edges of the shading and I put that little glow of red around in there. And I think it really, particularly on skin tones, brings out the color a lot. And this can work on tons of different skin tones. You just might need to adjust the colors to best suit the ones that you're working with. So with those things all down, you've got basic shading tucked away in your little artist toolkit. And now you've got the room to start exploring different methodologies, different approaches to shading, and really finding a type of shading that suits your art. And like, this is the fun bit. So what we've looked at so far is pretty basic cell shading, which is that hard line shading, but there's tons of different options. Soft shading is a really good one for people who are trying to produce a lot of art quickly. So for all you people out there doing webcomics, soft shading is something you can do with an airbrush, and the good thing about it is that you don't need to finesse the shapes as much because you can get away with a lot because the edges are soft and blurry. I also think it complements refined line art really well because it's a lot looser and just a lot more organic. It's also a really good option for like moody low lighting. Now you can get to a really happy medium between cell shading and soft shading by either taking like a smudge or a blur tool to your hard shading, or just really super refining your soft shading. And this is a good way to have those looser elements still while keeping a lot of the finer detail of cell shading. And now last but not least for today is screen tones. I feel like a lot of people forget about screen tones. It's pretty much, if you look at a lot of manga, it's what they'll use for shading. So it's tiny little dots that when you put them together when they're printed out will create darker sections on the drawing. Now this is a pretty hands-on method in traditional art, but on Clip Studio it's actually really easy. You can just create a new layer and fill it with the tone and adjust it to be whatever frequency you like. I do advise that if you want to work with screen tones, it's a good idea to print out some examples and have them up near you, just because they typically don't show up on screens how they would in print, so always keep that in mind. So beyond how you apply your shading, I really recommend that you just have a little play around with your layers. For instance, I really enjoy duplicating and blurring my shadow and highlight layers because I think it really adds that nice little glow to it and really brings out the colors a lot. Also, play around with different colors, like doing gradients within your shading. Go ahead and play around with the blending modes of your layers. Use some light colors, some dull colors, really vivid ones, and just have a little play around, and you'll be able to find tons of different moods that you'll be able to get from your lighting. Like, I think particularly a lot of newer digital artists get really bogged down in shading with grey and black, but it's a lot of fun to shade with different colors. I also really encourage leaning into those different blending modes for your layers if you're trying to do like a really cool moody piece. Or for instance this one, if we give him like a little magic fireball, we can add some solid green overlay or multiply layers to the whole drawing to kind of bring a cohesiveness to all the color. Because when you're doing effects like this, it's really great to have your lighting be a fun color. However, it can really stick out as kind of weird unless you unify the color palette, and this is a really kind of quick and easy way to do it without having to pain over color picking and all that. And like we talked about before, play around with your colors to get different effects. This is also a really good way to communicate your environment, so you can just tell if it's night or if it's in a really bright place, or if you're me, the land of vaporwave color palettes. And that pretty much brings us to the end of this little introduction to shading. And my parting words are pretty much something that some artists might not appreciate me saying, but really no one really cares how accurate your shading is so long as you make it look cool. And that's really your license to have fun and play around and try new things with your shading. If you've got the basics down, you can really push the limits and just kind of do whatever you want and just really play around and make good art. You know, establish your basic lighting directions and all that, and then just go for your life with overlay layers and multiply layers and really whatever you want. Now I hope you found this video helpful and enjoyable. I will be posting a more textual breakdown of this tutorial on the Clip Studio website, and I will post that down below. I want to get into making more tutorials, so feel free to leave a comment about what you would like to see me talk about. Otherwise, you can follow me on Twitter or Instagram at Veldenmeyer, and hopefully I will see you soon.